So, cheers.
Cheers.
Give me a sound check there. Did you come up with a military 1-2 for me yet?
No, I don't know what that is, Steve.
Fuck off.
It's part of that negative military stereotyping. Steve, this is John. Radio check.
Radio check. That's perfect.
Just say it loud and clear.
Welcome to Blind Spot. I'm Steve Reardon. My guest today is John Kingsbur. John is a retired naval officer who served 14 years in Naval Special Warfare, otherwise known as the SEALs, where he completed over 10 deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, East Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. His military career concluded with service as the executive officer, which is the deputy commander of a 250-person squadron. After transitioning from government service at the beginning of 2016, John served as the Director of National Operations at the startup online pharmacy PillPack. John, welcome to Blind Spot.
Steve, thanks for having me.
We've got a bunch of stuff to talk about, but I think what's interesting to kind of set the scene a little bit is you've had a very unusual career in the military and the Navy. You were a naval officer, you were a SEAL, and I know that this can be complicated to talk about, but how do you describe your service and how do you describe, for people out there who are not that familiar, kind of what you did in the military?
Well, as a SEAL, you grow up essentially learning a bunch of tactical skills, leadership. You do several deployments, and then in my case, it was
you go to BUDS. This is the training.
Right, you've got basic training, which is called BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL training. Then you get advanced training.
Is that hard? I mean, people say it's one of the hardest training regimens in the world. You get wet all the time. No?
You do get wet all the time, yeah, especially in the beginning. It's hard just looking at the attrition rate, which is, I don't know, depending on how you count it, it's probably around 75% or so, maybe a little higher.
And what are the characteristics of guys who get through that?
Well, it's a broad range of people, but probably the central characteristic is grit, I guess, which I just recently heard on some podcasts in the last year is a thing people talk about now. But it takes a lot.
Is that on Freakonomics? How to get more grit in your life?
Yeah, Freakonomics, and
right.
I think Tim Ferriss talked about it.
Right. So what does grit mean?
I don't know, but I know that it gets you through SEAL training.
Well, seeing as you got through SEAL training, you have to explain it to us, surely.
Well, you just have to have a certain level of perseverance to get through. It's not an athletic competition. That's one of the things that younger people who are considering that career path typically overestimate. They think it's like a triathlon club where it's not. I mean, some people who get through are football players, wrestlers, yes, triathletes.
Right.
Some people are not athletes at all. They're just tough and they know how to learn to get through, to learn the skills it takes to get through.
And is it perseverance? Is it tolerance to staying awake? I mean, what are the kind of the more tactical things you need? Tolerating being wet all the time. I don't like being wet. If I get sandy at the beach, I like having a shower. So is that that's not okay on BUDS?
Well, no, it's not going to help you, certainly. But being comfortable in the water definitely helps. I'm not a great swimmer. In fact, I think I'm widely considered to be one of the slowest people in the history of the SEAL teams and at swimming, certainly without fins. But yeah, it's being able to be comfortable being uncomfortable, I guess, if that's even a skill. But at the end of the day, if you want it bad enough, it's not that you like being wet and sandy. You can put up with it.
Right. So you get through basic training.
Well, let me just add one other thing.
Yeah.
Staying awake is not a skill in the beginning. They don't let you stay awake when you get tossed in the ocean every few minutes or more frequently sometimes, or if you're carrying a boat on your head for several miles, falling asleep is not something that happens.
Right, but the tolerance of not sleeping for long periods of time is something that's part of the training, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Testing your ability to continue functioning without sleep is something that it's definitely part of the basic training, and just by the nature of our work, it gets tested again and again in exercises and in real missions the rest of your career.
Right. So you went to the Naval Academy, right? And then, so you go to BUDS, you become a SEAL, then kind of what happens?
Well, you go You go to BUDS, which lasts a total of between 6 and 8 months, because there's a beginning portion that sort of counts as being at BUDS, but it can be a variable length. The core curriculum is 6 months. Then you go to advanced training, which is about 3 months, where you really focus more on skills. BUDS teaches very basic skills. BUDS really is a big focus on aptitude and teamwork and the tolerance of discomfort and pain, I think, if I had to break it down. Advanced training is a little bit more advanced. You're doing that with guys in your class, guys who are also newcomers. Then you go to a couple of specialized schools, and then you show up. That whole process usually takes, for me, it started in February of 2002 and ended in August of 2003.
Right. So you're going in to the SEAL teams kind of straight after 9/11, potentially. I mean, this is a time where everyone's mobilizing. I mean, tell me a little bit about that period in the armed forces.
Well, for us, we were in this really small community with a pretty focused goal. So it was exciting.
I mean, how big is the SEAL community?
I want to say it's about 2,500.
Okay.
Active SEALs.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, at that point in my career, my world was pretty limited to the 40-ish guys in my class who we went through all these trainings together.
Yeah.
And you're just really focused on getting through. But there's a sense of purpose there when you know that the war is going on. But at the end of the day, it's like all you really need to do is it's just a fantasy unless you get through whatever school you're in, and you have to focus on that. And so that's really upfront in your face.
Right. I mean, is there an added motivation to, I guess, pass, knowing that you want to get in the fight, or?
I'm not sure that actually changes someone's motivation to pass. Most people at that point, well, I'm thinking in my mind now of like the latter parts of the time. Most people who have what it takes to make it would make it whether we're at war or not.
Right.
And what it does, though, is it makes you realize that what you're learning is not academic.
What I always wanted to know about the SEALs is you obviously went to the War College. You were an officer. Do you go into the same training as the enlisted guys? Have you got guys there from high school? Does everyone have tertiary education? Kind of like break that down for me. Are you on a separate track? What do you do?
Yeah, I don't have statistics, of course.
Yeah.
You know how I don't like numbers very much. And the Naval Academy is different from the War College. The Naval Academy is the U.S. Navy's university. So one of the it's not exactly unique, but it's in the SEAL teams. Everyone goes through all the same basic training.
So you're training next to a guy who's just an enlisted guy, right?
Well, yeah, you can't say just an enlisted guy. I mean, these are some of the most talented people I've ever met. But
right.
Rank-wise, yeah, there's a difference. So I'm going through training at 23 with a master's degree, and some of the guys in my class are 18, and they joined the Navy straight out of high school.
Got you.
But there's also a decent chunk of people who are enlisted, and they have advanced degrees as well, either bachelor's or even master's in some cases.
Okay.
It's becoming more and more common recently.
Okay, so you qualify BUDS, you become a SEAL, and then there are different tracks. Like people can specialize, people can take different routes. Kind of explain to me what your path through the SEAL teams were.
Right. So let me backtrack just one step. So after you finish the advanced training, then you're officially a SEAL, and you get that designation in your record and everything, and you check into a SEAL team. Once you get to a SEAL team, depending on where it is in its cycle, and the cycle is, training and then deployment, and you potentially do even more training. You typically do more training. And then by the time you deploy, you've done probably 2 years worth of training, maybe more. And that's one of the differences between a special operations unit, particularly the SEALs, in my experience, and other units in the U.S. military, is that the lowest common denominator is just at a higher level of training and repetitions, and has gone through a selection with a more significant attrition rate. So that's how you start. And the neat thing, we can talk about this a little bit later, maybe when you talk about employability here or elsewhere in the private sector, but when you show up at a SEAL team, if you're an officer, you go straight into a leadership position. There's a little bit of mentorship. There's a lot of mentorship. It's almost like a apprenticeship kind of position, but you are in the seat, being in charge of a like half of a platoon of SEALs.
How many would that be?
So, yeah, platoon is 16, and your functional role in that organization, because 2 platoons often deploy together in a group of 32 plus staff, which can end up being like 100 people. So your functional role in that can change a lot over time, especially in the deployed environment where it's just more important things to do than when you're home and you're just training.
But I mean, managing just whatever 6 to 8 people at the age of like 23, 24 is fairly substantial if you compare it to the corporate world.
Yeah, it can be. And so you're responsible for a certain amount of equipment and the welfare of those people, but your main job is really learning how to be a tactical leader at the next level, as a platoon commander. That's sort of the early career milestone for a SEAL officer. So you check in, you get your role, you train up with your platoon or task unit is what the larger group is called. You deploy, and then the typical career path is that you do a deployment and then you do some kind of tour that diversifies your skill set. So you might work in a boat team, you might work in a staff, you might go to school. But what makes my background a little bit different is because of the tempo of the war, I just did 3 back-to-back deployments, and then I specialized is probably the wrong word, but I applied for and ended up working in a realm that General Stanley McChrystal has written a best-selling book about, where he structured a standing task force that, your audience can apply a strong focus on very specific specialized counterterrorist missions. Mm-hmm. And he had a very unique way of adjusting the structure for rapid, like network-style decision-making. And that's kind of what the book is about. And it's got a certain following here in the Valley and elsewhere, too, in the private sector. So working in that enterprise for the latter half of my career, doing shorter but more routine deployments.
Mm. And what would so what would a regular deployment cycle look like in your life over the second half of your career?
Well, it's tough to say. There's not a typical year. A couple of years I did two deployments per year, and then I ended up sort of specializing later just because we were working in a country where relationships matter. So I ended up going back there a bunch of times, and that ended up being 3 deployments spread over about a year and a half for continuity's sake. But the difference there is that some portion of every year you're probably going to be deployed. And whereas for some veterans or even in the special operations community, but especially elsewhere, a deployment is this thing you work up to, you do it, it's a big deal, and then you come back and you might move on to some other task or some other role. And in my case, and for the case of plenty of other people, it became just this lifestyle where you are constantly either working in a very high-risk capacity, or your friends are, and you're seeing the consequences even when you're home, or you're doing this very high-risk training when you're home. So how does that deployment cycle play into, I guess, civilian life, right? So a lot of these SEALs and personnel, you have families, you have wives, you're on this constant deployment cycle, 2 or 3 a year, high intensity training at home. How does that work? Well, you just make it work. The way it works really is because you have this network of people in the community who are all going through the same thing, and you form these incredibly strong bonds with the people you're going through, and your families all bond to. And it ends up feeling like a whole different planet almost compared to the way I'm living here. So it's not integrated into, I guess, what you would say civilian society is. I mean, you're living in a community that is formed primarily of Navy and relatively isolated, right? Well, it depends on what you mean by that. But it's not like we all live on base or neighbors, but we simply choose to spend most of our time together because we understand each other. And in a town like Virginia Beach, it's a very Navy town. So it becomes really, the community becomes, the community is what you make it. It happens to be a very dense military town with a lot of appreciation for what we do. So that's helpful. But the time that you spend with intimate friends is all people you choose, and they all typically tend to be from work because you have this powerful shared experience and you just like being around them.
So I'm interested in, I guess, a few things. I always like to shoehorn some policy stuff in if I can.
Of course.
So I guess for the listeners, just explain kind of the way you, being from the community of special forces, how you viewed, I guess, the deployments, the war on terror, the theaters in Afghanistan and Iraq, and kind of the different roles that special forces were playing compared to kind of conventional warfare.
Yeah, so if I comment on policy, it's just my opinion, and it may not be a common one. But let me talk first about the differences between the units, if I could. So I mentioned earlier about the difference. One of the primary differences is that lowest common denominator has more in a special operations unit, has more training, more repetitions, and has gone through some presumably more selective training. When you're deployed in an active combat theater like Afghanistan or Iraq prior to 2011. Conventional units, like, for your listeners, like the 82nd Airborne or a Marine Division or Marine Regiment, they own chunks of the country that they're responsible for, so they're geographically oriented. Special operations units will be geographically oriented as well, but they're sprinkled throughout the area, partnered usually with some kind of local unit. And we try to work collaboratively with the conventional owners or the conventional forces who own the space. So I'll report to a different boss, but I'll still maintain a strong relationship with the local Marine or Army battalion commander or brigade commander, depending on how big my sphere is. And so we'll partner with this local unit, and we'll either do things that help empower them, like provide advice and assistance and accompaniment with them on their missions. And we help drive those missions too. Or in some cases, you might be part of and that can look, some days it's very vanilla. We're doing a patrol with them and helping them learn their environment and how to react to it. And some days we're we're going on a raid together where we try to offload as much of the tactical work to them as possible, because that's really the most appropriate thing. And then there's other times when you're really in a high tempo force that just does raids to try to attrite to try to capture the enemy leadership figures to put pressure on them. Mm. And that usually involves a local force partnership too, but those are two slightly different things. One's kind of focused on collaboratively working in a geography, and the other one's focused on a specific mission.
Mm. So I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, counterterrorism more broadly. A lot of these special forces units have been very focused on counterterrorism. As you mentioned, there are raids to take out leadership, what would have all been under the global fight on terror, but kind of direct action against, I guess, terrorists in country. How do you, now having a little bit of perspective and looking back on your career and the work you did in that sphere, how do you think about the strategy that the U.S. employed to try and do that? And is there any, I guess, link to that is there any kind of strategy, any kind of military strategy that you think works? Is that war winnable in any realistic way?
Well, there's a question of the war. Well, the war on terror means different things to different people. There's a question of whether the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan are useful in countering terrorism. That's a fair question. And within that context, the way special operations were sometimes employed to put pressure on the leadership while conventional units sought to control the space and negotiations occurred with local government leadership. That was there's a little bit of debate about that, but it looks like it was pretty effective. But that's part counterterrorism, because these groups we're targeting are terrorists typically, although sometimes they're just really local insurgents. And then there's the counterterrorist fight in terms of really trying to mitigate the threat to the United States territory, and that's kind of a different thing. One of the interesting questions that I've never got a good answer to, and I don't think I ever will, is, especially in Afghanistan, why we felt the need to introduce a large scope of conventional forces to really control the territory. It seems historically misinformed, but anyway, we chose to do it. So one of the questions I have that's similar to what you asked is, in Afghanistan Take Two, would we have done less? Would we work to overthrow the government and have people in there with a really small footprint living principally off the local economy with some limited support. What would that have looked like? I don't know. And then there's always an active effort by multiple agencies in the U.S. government, including, of course, the Defense Department, working against terrorist threats who are more specifically focused here, and that can be unrelated to the active combat theaters, and sometimes they overlap.
I feel like it's very difficult to have a counterfactual, but it's kind of interesting to go back and say, do you think we were, were we successful? Did your unit actually breed success? But that's kind of a whole different thing. So that's very difficult to kind of nail down.
Well, but the thing I think there's pretty clear evidence, and mid-career officers when they're writing their theses, and some of them end up on blogs, they talk about some of these counterterrorism versus counterinsurgency. They're almost like two camps. I don't think it needs to be a binary, question, but it's a useful framework. There's pretty strong evidence in Iraq, for example, that in that the surge period, you had really strong control of the geography by pushing people out of their bases and living with the local government forces. You had a really strong network that McChrystal talks about in his book, really pressuring the leadership, and a big part of the success of the surge was the turning of the residents, the tribes, in our favor, at least temporarily. Obviously, that has taken on a new form with the rise of ISIS, but there's strong evidence that using counterterrorist forces as a pressure tool is effective, and I think there's other examples in history as well. I think that the idea that we shouldn't be putting direct pressure on terrorists and only working through negotiation, I think that's probably optimistic.
So this deployment cycle that you had over, I guess, 15 years, 10 deployments, and as you say, some of them in very, very high tempo direct action units. Do you ever think about the ethics of the job, kind of the actions that you and your unit took, and kind of the toll that took on you? Yeah, of course. It would be inhuman to not think about that a little bit. And this actually does sort of answer that last question you had about impact. So one of the ways that I would measure impact, it's tempting to look at the global geopolitical dynamics, but it's also, in my view, not a wise thing, because you have very little, as someone at my level, you have very little control over that. But when I worked as a strike force commander, for example, doing high tempo raids against leadership, there's very clear evidence that it was this happened to have been in Afghanistan. There's very clear evidence that Taliban attacks against outposts in certain districts where we focused dropped off significantly or even to zero. And I derive a large measure of satisfaction knowing that the U.S. troops and the Afghan troops at those outposts had a better quality of life, or maybe alive today, or not severely wounded because of actions we took. So at the tactical level, that's some of the things that I do think about. And I thought about that actively as I made decisions about allocating resources, where to focus, where we could have the most impact. A thing that's not well understood is that this is true to an extent with a conventional unit as well, but especially with a special operations unit. There's a lot of latitude to a pretty junior person deciding how he's going to structure his deployment time and how he's going to prioritize his resources, geographically and otherwise. You kind of do this, you get a turnover from the person that you are relieving. You do a little bit of what the design school would call need finding, but you're just talking to people and figuring out where your capabilities can best be applied to have the best impact against, in the U.S. and Afghan government favor, or Iraqi government, as the case may be, or other places, if that's where you are. So you have a lot of latitude in that regard, and that's a big part of the thing. So the ethics question, for me, I do look at it from a more tactical viewpoint. And I do think about the larger geopolitical things, but I don't beat myself up about it, because I was at the geopolitical level. Although I played a key role in the organization I was in, it was not
I wasn't making strategic political decisions, certainly.
I'm very intrigued by the idea of D-School sticky notes on the side of a canvas tent in the middle of Afghanistan. I think.
I know. Well, if you're a student here, you might think that they invented how people think, but it turns out they've done some really neat things to structure it into a process. But we're, if you're a young special operations leader, you get plucked down into geography. You learn it really quickly. You're at high risk yourself, and you're learning what you can best do to make an impact that's useful.
So I think that's a really good segue, and maybe we can pull off out of there. I mean, it's really interesting to me, I think, and let's talk about this. So you come out of the military. We've already touched on some pretty interesting skill sets that you build up. You're managing a very large force. I mean, what is the largest force you've managed by the time you come out? Like 250 people?
Yeah, my last job, I was the number 2 for 250 people. And then, the strike force deployments, I was, the highest number we got to was about 150. And a lot of that is support. Yeah. But, you're in charge of that whole, everyone who lives there. So
you've managed a ton of people, certainly for your life stage. Very, very complex problems, resource allocation, an enormous amount of money in equipment. You come out into the workforce post-retirement or post-leaving. How do you explain this experience, some of which is classified? How do you explain this on the job market? How does your job hunt go? How does the adaptation to civilian life look like for someone like you?
That's two. I would look at that as two different questions.
Well, maybe we start with the first one. I mean, how do you explain your experience in a civilian job hunt? And I mean, is there a way to even do that?
I've come to the conclusion. So let me just say that I'm not speaking for veterans generally. I would be happy to do that if I thought that made sense, but just to stick with what I know, I won't do that.
Because your experience is unique.
It's a little bit unique, but also, I've just got to, one of the things that people should take away from this conversation is that the military is not a homogenous place. It's as diverse. It's almost as diverse as the U.S. population.
Right.
So, if labels are positive, that can be helpful, but even then, it can be problematic. So, but to answer your question, is that I've essentially given up on trying to properly explain it in any kind of short format interaction because it's not that it's impossible, but it's challenging and it is pretty hard to talk about. So when it comes to me finding my next role, I have focused almost exclusively on people with whom I have a personal relationship who can refer me to somebody. And in my previous job search, that's what I did as well. Explaining it is really difficult. So if I go into and I'm exploring at a very low level of effort here, so I'm not in a great position to make general comments about this area compared to others, but I can make a couple. But, in the last week, I had a guy who knows me pretty well personally, who's a investor and serial entrepreneur in New York. He told me to think about a position on a founding team out there. Mm-hmm. And then here I had with a lot of capital behind it. So it's like it's a pretty compelling thing where he really values having varsity players on that team. Mm-hmm. And then here I also did an exploratory session with a placement service just out of curiosity. I was connected with them by somebody, but without any context on who I was. Right. And they sort of told me that in a really polite way that there's nothing for me to do around here that remotely fits my what I would expect to be challenging.
Right. So I think that's interesting, and something we've spoken about before, and something I've been looking at recently as well, is kind of this difference between hiring for experience and hiring for attributes, right? It's like and I think the way you described it. Well, I'll let you describe it, but have you found differences in employers in terms of that job search, and how does that play out for you?
Yeah, the framework we talked about once was it was described to me by somebody else, so I'll give him credit without naming him, in case he finds this embarrassing. It's but one of the talent professionals at a local venture firm here in Silicon Valley, he describes it as a checklist hire versus a best athlete hire.
Right.
if you're an HR professional, you're probably doing a checklist hire where you have a list of qualifications this person must meet, and someone like me and many other veterans, in this case I can sort of generalize, probably won't fit them. It'll probably say, I want someone with
5 years in
5 years of product management experience or HR experience in technology. And I have no doubt that I could learn that job, of course, but that's not what that's just not what they're looking for. And there are companies here and elsewhere who are looking for that person who has that right aptitude. From my limited experience, there's a little bit more of a demand for that aptitude in other job markets than here. But this is very premature, and that's okay. To me, that's part of the, another general veteran comment. If you're job searching is, you do have to make your own market. You have to meet enough people and explore enough opportunities where you can have a really solid baseline of what's out there and where your value can be best applied. Because people aren't really sure what to do with you, and you shouldn't shortchange yourself just because you aren't sure what to tell them. You have to kind of experiment with that. If you don't like what you're getting, either you can choose to keep looking, or you can choose to accept something, but it is your choice.
Do you get pigeonholed in operations? I mean, that was the one thing that I always just think about the veterans here is just there's so much of an inclination to just be like, oh, well, what you did was operations-y, so that's where we could put you.
That does happen frequently. But that's you. I mean, the good news is that that's a sign of someone trying to apply where they think you can be good.
Right.
And the military, the post-military job searching population is incredibly diverse. Some people are perfect for that kind of stuff. I mean, and in different companies, operations means different things. We know that. But the thing that there's a need to label you as having some kind of skill. And, like I kind of alluded to before, it's going to be tough to do that. So maybe you just have to keep looking for that person who's looking for the best athlete. Maybe this is more applicable for more senior veterans who have 5-10 years. I don't know.
One of the things I've also been thinking about is, so much of managing people, I guess, is about, drawing empathy with their problems or where they're at. How do you transition from being in a strike force or managing, people whose lives are on the line to managing people in, Silicon Valley, which is kind of one of the nicest places on earth where the sun's shining and, the roads are paved with gold. Can you generate the empathy? Is that something you struggle with?
No, I don't. Well, I'd like to think I don't struggle with that. And I haven't had to lead here, but I did in the startup environment in Boston.
Yeah.
I found people are fundamentally pretty similar across the board. It's a different context, certainly, but the people on your team are still people, and you develop some pattern recognition and habits, good or bad. I'd like to think mine are more good than bad, and but you develop that by spending a lot of time doing it. One of the key things that is, you're not going to convince a company that they need this if they don't already acknowledge it themselves, but one of the differences, you sort of pointed this out a second ago, is that if you're in a leadership position in the military, well, if you're an officer, day one, you're in some kind of designated leadership position. And people don't just say how high when you say jump by any means. So it's real leadership. And it's different to be...
I think that would surprise people. I think most people think you bark an order and everyone does what you say you're doing because you're the officer.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, that's such an ignorant stereotype. It's hard for me to find words for it. It's not, especially in the special operations community, but elsewhere too. So you show up, you're in a position of designated leadership. That does mean something. You're in the seat. You are accountable for people, their welfare, and the outcome of your unit. And there's something different about being in the seat than reading about it or thinking about it or watching someone else do it. That's valuable. I'm convinced it's valuable, and I'll find a place when I look for my next role, I'll find a place that thinks that's valuable. But a lot of companies don't sit around and say, oh, I think we have a leadership problem. Let's find someone to come in and solve it. Because people don't want to admit that in the first place. And,
right.
But it doesn't even mean they have a problem. I'm just saying that that's an aptitude and a strength. Leadership and decision-making and judgment. In the military, they're treated almost like skills, especially as you promote how you handle ambiguous situations and how you treat people, essentially, and make decisions is how you're evaluated. And not just evaluated, but what your next posting is may likely depend on how well you perform in those kind of subjective categories in your previous one. And the other thing that's really significant is you develop the ability to learn quickly in the military. And one of the reasons why that's true is every 2 or 3 years you're moving, you're changing roles in a lot of cases. So that means every 2 or 3 years you're being introduced to a new group of possibly strangers as their leader, and you have to perform and build rapport with them all at the same time and navigate that. And there's value in that as well.
So how do you do that? Because I think there are a lot of people here that are going into a new leadership role, perhaps even their first leadership role, who are not sure about how to do that. What do you have out of your experience that makes that transition successful?
I think a lot boils down to empathy, like you were talking about. You have to understand what motivates your people and what they care about. And you have to balance that with what the organizational objectives are, because you can't just be a nice guy, but you also recognize that people will not respond to you if you don't lead with some kind of empathy. Is there,
because one of the things about the military that is marginally different to civilian life is, and maybe it's not, so maybe this is another stereotype I've got wrong, quite difficult to get rid of people. So, hard to get fired out of the military, but perhaps in your community easier than in others. Is that something that is different, or is that something that's, I guess, the same and just a stereotype?
That there's nuance there that probably merits some explanation, right. Because that can be so. It's hard to get fired out of the military completely, right? To lose your paycheck. It's very easy in some units to get fired from your position, and that's a huge. I mean, for a lot of these, like I said, your value is partly in your reputation that you've built over real experience. So getting fired is a big deal especially in a special ops unit, but that could be a career ender. It doesn't mean you're going to end up homeless, but it means that you could easily get fired. And it's not that much different in a conventional like infantry unit. If you're a Marine platoon leader or company commander, if you're not performing well, there's a good chance you're going to lose your job. And once that happens, you have a cushion. You will probably have a chance to look for another position, but your career is essentially ended. And for most high-performing people, which are the kind of people who get into those positions in the first place, that is just as bad as losing your job, right? Like your actual income. In my specific corner of the military, you could get fired any day, and that's just kind of the nature of the beast.
So I want to talk just briefly about, I guess, people that you meet, civilians more broadly, and it bears witness to the job search. There is, how do you find people react when you tell them that you have military experience? Is there a way that you have to couch that? Because a lot of people here in the Valley talk about the civilian military divide and the fact that there is a public perception problem about the military. Is that something you've encountered, or is it something you think about?
Yeah, I think about it, certainly. People generally respond positively when you tell them about your service, and I for one, appreciate that.
I guess the interesting part of that is, so I have some debates with some of the veterans here, which is, in order to bridge the civil-military divide, I think it's a good thing that veterans talk a little bit more about their service. But sometimes the service is so removed from civilians' own experience that interaction is kind of othering, or it's it puts you apart in a way that people become skeptical of you or whether you're damaged, whatever. And I'm not sure we can use this anyway. I'm not sure this is actually fruitful, but it's just something I'm interested in.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know what other people's motivation is when they meet you. There's a little bit of labeling that goes on, obviously, in my D school class with Bernie Roth, we talk a little bit about that as for right or wrong, it changes your perception of someone that you might have assessed differently without that label. If the labels are generally positive, but whether I'm doing it because people require it or I'm doing it of my own volition, I'm not sure, but I do tend to try to soften myself. I do try to minimize how much I talk about it. about my previous service, or I try to talk about it in a funny way as much as possible. Maybe that's, I don't know. I don't want to place a value judgment on that either. That's just kind of the way I manage it. But for the most part, it's a positive response. But people are right if they think they don't really have a good benchmark for what I'm talking about when I talk about my last. I mean, it's completely alien to the life that people, the average person here has no way to really comprehend what planet Earth as I know it prior to 2016 was like.
So, I mean, I guess, the one nice thing about being here is you have a platform. I mean, what would you say to both, I guess, civilians or people that interact with veterans, and more specifically to kind of employers and companies that are evaluating veterans for their companies? I mean, what do you think the correct approach is?
I think the correct approach to me is just acknowledging the extreme nuance in that question to begin with, and the diversity of the population we're talking about. And there's people who are just supremely talented who end up in the military out of a sense of purpose, or maybe they're late bloomers and they realized, some level of skill during their time there based on maybe the structure or a mentor they had. So there's a huge array of people, but what they should think about, I think, I hope people think about that best athlete concept, especially for the way it implies that if you're hiring someone with a military background, that's a broad number of people, but recognize that there's a decent chance that person is really good at learning, and they have some real leadership experience, which will be rare for their age compared to their typical peer, if I can be that broad. But I mean, I'm acknowledging that I don't, it's a tough question to answer.
What does leadership mean to you?
That's a tough question. I mean, I've never met someone whose opinion I've never encountered a good explanation for that and most of the people who I know and respect as leaders would probably say, we can try to define it, but it's just something you see, you know it when you see it. And I know that's the wrong answer for a campus like this one, where there's supposed to be answers, preferably accompanied by numbers to every question. But
so
it's hard to say.
So let me give you a better one. Who have you seen in your life that you consider a great leader?
I mean, they're mostly military figures. But actually, the PillPack co-founders I found to be extremely good leaders. It's like and I see this with much less evidence, but in cases or in class visits with other high-performing CEOs, they seem to have a either natural sense or they've been coached on things that took me a while to learn, and that's one of the. So I've seen it here for sure. The thing that I find a little bit strange here, though, is that there's an idea that a person's leadership ability is based purely on maybe the outcome of their company, and maybe they're good at a bunch of things and they're super driven. That doesn't necessarily mean they're a great leader.
John Kingsbur, thanks for coming on Blind Spot.
Thanks for having me, Steve.